The Vampire Chronicles. Chapter Fran and the Legacy of Blood. The dark streets of London seemed to close tighter around me at night, as if trying to trap me in their web of shadows and decay. Every step echoed against the walls of the narrow alleys. The cobblestones, still wet from the rain, glistened faintly, and the fog hung over everything like a cold veil. The sparse light from the few street lamps was swallowed by the shadows of the narrow alleys and the twisted paths of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. My stomach twisted in hunger, but it was another craving that tormented me, a thirst unlike anything I had ever known. The thirst within me was like an unending pain, a fire that would not be extinguished, a ticking that grew louder and louder. Deep down, I knew what I had to do to quell the craving, but the thought of becoming a being that takes life made me shudder. My endless path led me to a narrow alley near Old Nickel Street, past abandoned shops and houses that stood like crumbling temples of humanity, silent witnesses of decay, now home to those who had turned their backs on the day. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the darkness of Hansbury Street. Tall and slender, cloaked as though wrapped in shadow, Bosse, my creator, leaned against the wall of a decaying building. His pale, sharp features looked almost ghostly in the dim of light of the lanterns. But his gaze was relentless. He fixed his eyes on me as if he could peer into the depths of my soul. The man who made me what I now was. "The hunger is tormenting you, isn't it?" His voice was deep, carrying an eternity's weight through the darkness. "Yes," I stammered, avoiding his gaze. "But I can't. It feels wrong." "The thirst nights are always the hardest," he replied. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, as the craving inside me burned brighter and consumed me from within. Yet the idea of taking a human life was such a horrifying thought that it seemed like an unspeakable atrocity to me. "I just can't," I managed to say again, my voice barely more than a whisper. I was even a vegetarian once," I added, full of anger at my predicament summoning of my last ounce of strength. A strange smile, a joyless laugh played on his lips, almost melancholic, and he nodded slowly as if he could understand my inner struggle. "Ah, the idealism of mortals." He placed one hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was both comforting and challenging. "A vegetarian? Well, my boy, this is something else entirely," he continued, almost pleading. "Your hunger isn't something that can be sated with a piece of meat, and certainly not with some damned cauliflower schnitzel. It's not merely a meal, it's the preservation of your being. If you ignore the thirst, you lose control over it. Eventually, it will break free, and when it does, it will end in a bloodbath. Trust me, I know." He stared briefly into the darkness of the street, as if searching for memories of a long-hidden tragedy in the shadows. I shook my head, my hands trembling. But there must be another way. Porter sighed, and for a moment a shadow fell across his face, as if summoned by memories of ancient horrors. You know, he began, I once thought I could escape the thirst, that I could reconcile with my old life, exist in peace. But I lost control. The thirst, it's like a beast inside you, a creature you cannot tame, only feed. Centuries ago, he murmured, I was like you, stubborn, clinging to illusions of my old life. But the thirst took over and I lost myself. An entire city drowned in blood because I tried to convince myself that I was different. His words hit me with the force of a distant, dark realization. The thought of enduring myself, someone who would rather be dead, and carrying this existence like a ticking time bomb shook me to my core. So you hunt, I said quietly, my gaze fixed on my palms. But you don't just kill indiscriminately, I added, still clinging to the last threads of my humanity. He nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. Yes, I choose my prey, souls who are ready to leave this world anyway, but those who poison the lives of others. His voice was a dark whisper that drifted into the night. Lost souls, those who have been driven into darkness. Thieves, murderers, desperate souls teetering on the edge of life. And when death is already standing before them, I take my chance. He placed a hand on my shoulder and looked at me intensely. You must learn to embrace the darkness and extinguish the light in the eyes of those who bring only chaos. I looked at him and wondered how long he had wandered these dark streets, how many lives and centuries he had seen. And how do I find such lost souls? A faint smile appeared on his lips again, but this time it was warmer, almost proud. You have a sense for it. It's deep within you, the legacy of the blood. He leaned back and gestured me to follow. When we reached the next corner, we stopped in a narrow side street. I'll give you time, he said, as if he knew I needed time to let go of the shadows of my humanity. When the thirst becomes too strong, you won't be able to think anymore. So learn to choose. Bosse placed both hands on my shoulders and gave me a nod, sending me into the darkness. With a slight nod, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone. I walked, guided by hunger, accompanied by moral conflict. The city was silent, but I could feel its heart stirring beneath the surface. In this night, I roamed the alleys of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, searching for those who had distanced themselves from the light of life. Finally, in the dark shadow of a building's wall, I found one. I heard footsteps behind me, the faint scrape of a knife, the sharp intake of breath from a desperate man who had nothing left to lose. His eyes were hollow, but within them reflected the sorrow of the entire world. I remembered Bosse's words. for I was searching for a lost dark soul whose flame barely flickered in the fog of this city. I need the money, he stammered, his hands trembling. His eyes were filled with panic and greed as he pressed the knife against my throat. I absorbed his voice, his desperate words, his broken soul. Everything in me seemed to pull him in, screamed to pull him into the darkness and quench my thirst. But something in his eyes made me hesitate. There was a pain I recognized, a suffering deeply rooted within him. It felt like a reflection of my own lost soul. He apologized for his actions and spoke endlessly of his misery, of the fate that had driven him into this alley. It was my fate. His voice trembled and his face mirrored a pain that I carried deeply within myself. When his story ended, I paused. The hunger still burned within me, but I did not resist. I let him go and watched as he disappeared into the shadows of the dark alley. Later, I met Bosse again. He looked at me with an expression somewhere between mockery and recognition. Mercy is a luxury few can afford. You show mercy, he said almost pensively. Then so be it. Franciscus the Merciful, Fran, a name that might endure in the shadows of centuries. But remember this, merciful Fran, your merciful act will only pull you deeper into the whirlpool of desire. Franciscus, the name lingered in the air like a sigh, and I knew I would carry it from this moment onward. Later, when the darkness became almost tangible and my hunger roared through every fiber of my body like a sharp, insistent pulse, I found my victim. A man whose crime still glistened on his blade. Blood, fresh and warm, dripped from the knife, pooling silently on the ground as a silent witness to his act. I knew what he had done. I could smell it, taste it. The echo of the crime pulsed in the air. The murderer lifted his head, and in that moment, our eyes met. A wave of pure panic washed over him. He dropped his bloodied knife, his face pale, and without a word or attempt to justify himself, he turned and fled into the night. I stood still, my breathing shallow, my thoughts overshadowed by a desire I could not longer control. My gaze wandered to the lifeless body lying in a pool of blood and street dust. The victim, a human as I once was, a soul driven to the edge of life and pushed over. I knelt beside the still figure, almost as if in a form of reverence, and for a moment I felt something like sorrow, a reminder of the fragility of life, of my own mortality, which I had lost forever. But the hunger was now unstoppable. I leaned forward, my senses overwhelmed by the scent and allure of the blood. Everything I had feared that night was forgotten, smothered beneath a relentless urge to survive. My teeth pierced the still warm neck of the victim, and I felt the life flow from him into me, warm and sweet, like the fulfillment of an ancient desire I could no longer deny. With every drop I drank, the world around me seemed to grow quieter, sharper and yet more distant, as if in a dream where only the present mattered. When I rose, the thirst within me was momentarily sated, and a profound peace spread through me. The first faint rays of morning light crept over the rooftops of the buildings, casting a pale glow into the winding alleys. I gazed into the distance and thought of the name Bosse had given me. Fran. Franciscus the Merciful. A name that bound me to dive into darkness again and again, but with the possibility of seeing a face other than my own reflected within it. To be continued.